Hi there. So welcome to our next lesson on investment appraisal. And as I mentioned in our introductory discussion, this is one of the key decisions that the financial manager makes. And because we said that among other things, the financial manager or the CFO helps the business to make a lot of decisions in relation to what is done. We mentioned that the business can make decisions in relation to, or the CFO can help the business to make decisions in relation to investment activities, in relation to financing, where do we get the money from, and then the cost of the money. And we mentioned that when it comes to financial management in level 2, what the CFO or what the financial manager does here is basically seeking finance, usually in the short term, right? Usually in the short term and not necessarily in the long term. But when it comes to level 3 advanced financial management, the CFO is looking for finance in the long term. So we're looking for strategic planning decisions, okay? Strategic financing decision. Where are we going to get steady source of finance for the next 5 years, for the next 10 years in relation to the achievements of the objectives of the organization. So we are talking about long-term strategic planning and how the CFO helps the business to undertake that. And we spoke about the issue about the fact that the financing decision of the organization affects the dividend policy of the organization. In other words, if the organization decides that they are going to be financing a lot of their projects using retained earnings, then that means that they have to reduce how much dividend that is paid out, or they have to reduce the dividend payout ratio. But we said also that with the dividend policy, the business has to take into consideration, or the business must take into consideration a lot of factors, right? The tax position of the individuals, and then the various things that have to be taken into consideration. They have to consider the returns, okay, of the individual, whether they are interested in annual dividend or they are interested in capital appreciation. So whether the investor is a short-termist or a long-term minded investor, because there are some investors, they invest their money and they want a steady flow of income. There are some investors, they invest their money and they are waiting to dispose of the investment 5-10 years from now and make some huge amount of money. So the factors, in all other factors, affects the dividend policy of the organization. Then the last thing is about risk management decision, which I said we'll be looking at later on in relation to foreign or forex currency risk management, interest rate risk management, and other issues that we'll be discussing later on. So narrowed down here, what we want to consider is to look in detail the issue about the investment decisions of the organization. Now, as I mentioned once again in my earlier discussion or in my introductory discussion, the investment decisions it's a call. Investment decision is a call decision that a CFO helps the board of directors and the organization to make. Now, these decisions about investments, usually what we're talking about here is about capital investment decisions, okay? Not about revenue investment decision, but rather about capital investment decisions. But a portion of it can be in relation to investment decisions for the day-to-day running of the organization. That is in relation to working capital management, which we will look at in financial management, but not in advanced financial management. So when we talk about the investment decision here, our focus more primarily is on capital investment decisions, which can include a lot of decisions like the acquisition of a new plant and machinery, the purchases of vehicle, acquisition of a business, opening of a branch or a segment of a business or a new location of a business, So all these can come as a result of what? Investment decision. So any decision that requires management or any decision that requires the organization to be able to set aside or put in place some amount of money that is going to go beyond one accounting year is what we talk about or discuss as the capital investment decisions. So here we want to look at what the various methods through which we're going to be appraising those decisions, because I told you that in every investment decision that the organization makes, the objective is that the organization will only accept and implement projects that have what? Positive, that add positive value to the organizations, or organization will invest in projects that will maximize the wealth of the shareholders, all other things being equal, because of the agency relationship. So management must take or make all decisions in the best interest of the shareholders. Now, so as we'll be looking at later on, the investment decision that the organization makes should only add value to the company. Nonetheless, there are some investment decisions that the organization makes that doesn't add value to the shareholders, or that doesn't increase the wealth of the shareholders, but are legislative decisions that the business has to make. For instance, every business is supposed to have some safety or safety gadgets or fire equipment. So if you go to well-developed institutions or standard institutions like the financial institutions, manufacturing institutions, you realize that they have fire gadgets and all those things there, pipes and water basins that would help the organization that will help the organization to handle the issue about fire outbreaks before the fire service comes in. So if you look at it, these are capital investment decisions. Now, directly, these expenditures are not going to add value to the shareholders. It is not going to maximize the wealth of the shareholders. Why? Because the management are now going to be using the shareholders' money to meet a legislative requirement. So there are some investment decisions that is by law, it is by statute. So in that case, the organization undertakes it without necessarily appraising it to see whether it will maximize the wealth of the shareholders or not. So the only key thing is that it is a legislative requirement, and as a legislative requirement, it has to be followed and has to be undertaken by the organization. So when it comes to capital investment decisions, these are the two aspects. By statute, okay, by law or by legislation, what you must have. Then also optional, what the organization has to undertake in order to gain competitive advantage in its respective industry and also maximize the wealth of the shareholders of the company. Right, so having had the understanding of what investment decisions are about in a general sense, let's look at some issues in relation to investment decisions by for-profit making organizations and also not-for-profit making organizations. Now, this segregation is very important. The reason is that when a for-profit making organization, that is a profit-making organization, makes an investment decision, remember what I said a moment ago, it is to what? Maximize the wealth of the shareholders. So if the investment is not going to maximize the wealth of the shareholders, all other things being equal, and it is not legal, then they are not going to undertake that investment project. But when it comes to not-for-profit making organizations, they are not looking at the wealth of the shareholders, because remember, there are no shareholders there. Rather, they are looking at the maximization of the welfare of the beneficiaries or those who will be affected by the investment. So they just look at the cost and benefit analysis, and all other things being equal, irrespective of how expensive the project is, once the money is available, not-for-profit making organizations will undertake the project without necessarily appraising the project and finding out whether it will maximize the wealth. All they are looking for is, does it maximize the welfare of the beneficiary, or does it maximize the welfare of the people who are going to be using these investments, assets, or projects that we are undertaking? So when it comes to not-for-profit making organizations, their investment decisions are different, okay, from the commercial organization for several reasons. The first one is that Where there are two or more ways of achieving the same objectives, that is mutually exclusive investment opportunities, a commercial organization might prefer the option with the lowest present value of cost. That is the first thing. So if there are two projects that has to be undertaken, now mutually exclusive projects are projects which are independent on their own. In other words, mutually exclusive projects are projects whose undertaking does not depend on the undertaking of another project. It means mutually exclusive projects are different. So you either take this or you take that, right? But the mutually inclusive projects are projects that goes together. In other words, you cannot undertake one and not take the other, because the two of them must be undertaken together to be able to achieve an objective. So the first reason we're saying as what makes investment by the not-for-profit making organization different from commercial organizations is that if there are two or more mutually exclusive projects, the commercial organizations are likely going to take the option with the lowest present value of cost. That is the thing, because they always want to reduce the cost that they are going to be incurring, but maximize the profit or revenue that they are going to be earning. But the not-for-profit organizations, they won't go for the lowest cost, but they will go for the one with the highest benefits to the welfare of the people. Second, relatively few not-for-profit organizations' capital investments are made with the intention of earning financial returns. So it is only a few of not-for-profit making organizations' investment projects or investment decisions that are made to earn some returns. Only a few. Because most of the project they undertake is not really for returns, it's not really for financial profit, it's not really for any financial benefit. They're just doing it to help the community, they're just doing it to help the people, they're just doing it to help the beneficiaries. But the organization will not undertake any investment project. Commercial organizations will not undertake any investment project with the intention of just helping the people. Now, this is different from corporate social responsibility. We are not talking about corporate social responsibility here. We are talking about real investment decisions that these two segments of businesses can make in relation to that. Third, the cost of capital that is applied to project cash flows by the public sector will not be a commercial rate of return, but one that is determined by the government. So that is also one of the things. You know, when we are appraising projects, as we saw in the last three lessons, you realize that we're going to be calculating the cost of capital, right? The sources of finance. So if we are going to finance this project with some equity and then some debt, then we're going to be calculating the weighted average cost of capital for that finance. And so we're going to use that weighted average cost of capital of that finance to be able to finance our projects, to be able to appraise, our project and find the present value of the project and realize if it is acceptable or not acceptable. But for profit-making organizations, they are not looking for the cost of the money that is really coming in, because it's more or less like a donation. It's not. So they will use a rate that is substantially lower, that is substantially not based on commercial rate, that is substantially not based on the current borrowing rate, or that is not based on any rate, but a rate that has been usually standardized if it is a public institution by the government, and if it is a not-for-profit institution that has been standardized by the Executive Council for the not-for-profit making organization. So any target that a public sector organization or public sector investment has to meet before being accepted will therefore not be based on the same criteria as those in the commercial sector. So when we are appraising projects in public sector, not-for-profit making organization, not-for-profit making industry, the kind of targets they are going to set, the kind of criteria they are going to use to appraise that project, to detect or to determine whether that project should be accepted or not, is going to be different from the criteria that a commercial business is going to be using. Remember what I said, we want to undertake a project that will maximize the wealth of the shareholders. But for profit-making organizations, they want to undertake projects that will maximize the welfare of the beneficiaries or those who are affected. So you realize that the criteria is different. As such, the points, the targets, what we look for, the factors we take into consideration, all these things are going to be different in these two worlds when we are talking about investment decision. Now the next thing we want to look at is to consider the issue about the capital budgeting process. The capital budgeting process. Now when we talk about capital budgeting, it's a very key aspect that a financial manager has to take into consideration in relation to finding out where we get the money from and then how we can invest in projects that will give us returns in the shortest possible time, and also make the resources available and allocate those resources for various investment projects that the business wants to undertake. So when we say capital budgeting, what do we mean? Capital budgeting is the process of identifying, analyzing, and selecting investment projects whose returns are expected to extend beyond 1 year. So the capital budgeting process involves identifying what projects can we invest, analyzing, are these projects within the scope of the organization, will it maximize the wealth of the shareholders, will it bring a positive returns, selecting, then which of these projects can we select, and the objective of the selection is that it has to give us a returns that goes beyond what? 1 accounting year. Right, so there are other issues that we can talk about in relation to the creation of capital budgets. The capital budget will normally be prepared to cover a longer period than sales, production, and resource budget, say from 3 to 5 years. So the capital budget will be like more or less like a strategic budget. So as I mentioned earlier, the financial manager, when we talk about a pure investment decision, is looking at the strategic 5 years, so 3 to 5 years, medium and long-term decision making. So what projects should we take in the short term? What projects must we take in the medium term? And what projects must we take in the long term in order to stay competitive and also in order to maximize the wealth of the shareholders? Now, even though this is going to be a strategic plan for 3 to 5 years, it will be broken down into periods, all right? It will be broken down into periods of other budgets like annual budgets or semi-annual budgets, and it can be broken down into monthly budgets or even weekly or daily budgets so that the organization can be able to track itself to maximize the wealth of the shareholders. Organizations also may have defined time period during which proposals are considered so as to allow for an indication of expected expenditure in the forthcoming budget period. So in the preparation of the capital or during the capital budgeting process or planning, the organization will set defined periods where we're going to meet and then brainstorm and realize what kind of project do we undertake in the forthcoming year. So for instance, we have our strategic plan. In the next 5 years, this is what we want to do. At the end of every year or at the end of every 6 months, we have to meet and see what project do we undertake in the next 6 months so that we can plan for it, make all the finance that has to be made available so that we can undertake the project and stay competitive within our industry. Alternatively, proposals may be accepted on a regular basis, allowing greater scope for investment in unanticipated opportunities. So sometimes we don't have a defined period, but we just have a regular meeting with those charged with governance so that they brainstorm, come on board, all right, this is the new trend in the market. So let's do this year. It will help us to scale up. It will help us to make more profit. So we can do all these. So either the organization has a defined period where we meet and decide what to do, or a regular basis so that we can, a regular meeting period so that the organization can take advantage of opportunities that they may have not anticipated for in their strategic plan. Now, projects which emerge during a budget period may be disadvantaged compared with those anticipated when the budget was set. So yes, we can meet on a regular basis and someone will say, all right, let's launch this product, let's produce a new product. But that kind of idea that pops up on this regular basis, which are not originally in the strategic plan, are likely not to be undertaken. Because you see, the strategic plan, it's where management sits down, spends a lot of time, makes decisions about what they want to make, or the product they want to produce, the investment decisions that they want to make over the long term. So now, if that is what they want to make, anything that comes in the short term, which does not fall into the budget, into the capital budget of the organization, that means that something that is in the plan or something that is in the capital budget may have to be eliminated so that that money will be used to finance what has just come up. So it's likely that the new idea or any idea or project that arises outside the capital budget of the organization, it's going to be rejected or not taken into consideration within the shortest possible time. Now, why does the organization undertakes or prepare, why would the organization prepare a capital budget for 3 years, 5 years, so that it will determine what kind of projects it will undertake, what kind of finance it will need, and then what are the various costs that those finance are going to be worth for the organization? Why? The reason why organizations undertake or carry out capital budget processes is to be able to determine what we refer to as budget limits or constraints on their resources. Remember, as economics tells us, resources are scarce. Now, in actual sense, resources are not scarce. If you want as much resources as possible, all other things being equal, you can get it. But the means to get the resources, which is going to be money, finance, funding, it's limited. Now, so because of the funding being limited, organizations are always constrained and have to budget as to how they are going to allocate the minimum fund to various aspects of the organization, and again, to be able to help the organization to maximize the wealth of the shareholders. So sometimes, usually, organizations can have budget limitations or constraints internally or externally. Now, we'll be looking at this later on, but I'm going to emphasize it here a little bit, and then later on we will look at it closely. But what budget limits or constraints are about can be internal or external. Internally, it is what we refer to as soft capital rationing. Now, this is where management puts in place internal constraints, okay, or management puts in place internal limitation or imposes internal limitations that limits the organization in order not to spend an amount beyond a certain target that has been made. So for instance, the organization can say that this year we want to invest up to $200,000. What it means is that once the organization invests up to $200,000, it cannot invest again. It is called soft capital rationing. It is called what the organization, the internal constraints which the organization or management has imposed on the utilization of the funding resources of the organization. Now, why is this important? This is important because probably management perceives that during the year they can raise additional finance, or they can raise retained earnings of only $200,000. So if they can raise retained earnings of $200,000, then they can only spend up to $200,000. This is what we refer to as the internal or soft capital rationing. But there are some times that constraint is placed on the organization's resources. Constraint is placed on the organization's ability to fund positive NPV projects, not because management has decided that they are not going to invest, but because of external factors. Now, so the external factors which limits, constraints the resources available to the organization to be able to invest are what we refer to as hard capital rationing. So the hard capital rationing can come from various sources. For instance, they can come from loan covenants, or what we call loan contracts. So for instance, if your business comes to borrow money from me, and I give your business around $10 million, and then in our debenture contract, in our contract or covenants, we agree that until you pay me this $10 million, you don't have any rights to borrow money from anywhere. What it means now is, if you exhaust this $10 million and there are still some positive projects that you want to invest in, there is no way you can raise another extra money from debt because of the covenant that I have had with you. It means I am limiting how much money that you can use in your business, not because you have decided not to use more, but because of the contracts that you have had with me. That is called hard capital rationing. The external factors that limits an organization as to how much resources that is available to it to be able to undertake projects that will maximize the wealth of the shareholders. So in a nutshell, projects can be classified in the budget into those that are generally arising from the top management policy decisions or from sources such as mandatory government regulations, as I mentioned earlier, like health, like safety, like welfare, capital expenditure, and other things. And those that tend to be appraised using the techniques covered in this chapter and the next. Now, the administration of the capital budget is usually separated from that of the other budgets, okay? So, you know, we have the cash budget for every year. We have the sales budget. If you are doing management accounting, these things, I know you have learned them already. So, level 3, you have learned those things already. Sales budget, labor budget, production budget, what else? Material budget. So all these budgets are separated from what we refer to as the capital budget, all right? So the one who maintains, the one who monitors, the one who controls, and what goes into it is different from what goes into the other budget. Now, so in most cases, what happens is that the overall responsibility for authorization and monitoring of capital expenditure is in most large organizations the responsibility of a committee. So in most large organizations, before a capital investment decision will be made and an expenditure will be authorized and monitored, it has to be, or implemented, it has to be agreed by what? A committee. So, but in some other organization, it is not about committee, they just set a hierarchy. For instance, expenditure up to $75,000 may be approved by individual divisional manager. Expenditure between $75,000 and $150,000 may be approved by divisional management. Expenditure over $150,000 may be approved by the board of directors. So in large organizations, normally every capital expenditure project, there is a dedicated committee that appraises that project and analyzes that project and authorizes the project. But in some organizations, it is segregated so that if you're the head of the production department, there is a limit of expenditure that you can spend in relation to your department improving. So if we give you the limit, anything below that you can spend without the authorization of anybody, once you know that it is something that will maximize your productivity and also maximize the wealth of the shareholders in the long term. But anything beyond a certain limit, you have to go to the next level of management, maybe to the board of directors or to the respective committees within the organization. So these are what you have to understand when we talk about the issue in relation to capital budgeting process. The next thing we want to consider is the investment decision-making process. The investment decision-making process. Now, this is a very exhaustive area, but I'm going to try as much as possible and make it real snappy here because I've been talking for about 30 minutes now, and we just have to get busy and start doing the calculations thing here. But hey, these are all very important. Now, so when we talk about investment making decision, typically it goes through 4 distinct stages. In other words, before an organization can say, bam, we have accepted this project and we are going to undertake this project, it has to go through 4 stages. And it is very important for you to understand how each of these stages work and how they help the organization in order to make the final decision. So I'm going to put the 4 stages down and then we take them one after the other. Right, so we have origination of proposal, then we're going to have project screening, then we will have analyzing and acceptance, then monitoring and review. These are the 4 decisions. Now I'm going to make them snappy here. Origination of proposal simply means that the organization must have a system in place where ideas can be generated on various projects that could be of various opportunities, investment opportunities that organization can take advantage of in order to stay competitive in the industry and also to maximize the wealth of the shareholders. So origination of proposal can come from various departments. It can come from board of directors. It can come from those charged with governance. It can come from lower operational managers. So at the first level, ideas can come from various sources. Sales department will say, let's buy more sales cars, more sales delivery vehicles. Production department may say that, hey, let's invest more in a new state-of-the-art plant and machinery to help us to improve our productivity. Then maybe the accounting department will say, let's invest in this new software that will help us to integrate all our operations. And board of directors will say that, hey, let's see if we can launch a new product. So the production manager will say, all right, we've undertaken some research and we realize that we can run a new product or we can modify or improve upon an existing product. So ideas can originate from various sources, various angles of the organization. That is the first step. So at the first step, we can say that maybe 10 ideas popped up from various organizations. Then the next thing is about project screening. Now, the fact that you mentioned that we should do something does not mean it is in line with the scope of the organization. So the projects have to be screened to take into consideration whether the project falls into the strategic plan of the organization, whether the project falls into the strategic objective of the organization, whether the project falls into the mission, vision, and the goal of the organization, whether the projects are going to be technically visible by the organization. So we're going to screen the project using a couple of criteria to test to see if the projects actually qualify to be proceeded or to be undertaken by the organization. At the project screening stage also, the organization will be interested to look at the legal aspects of that project. Will that project affect a law or becomes a breach of law and order, or will that project be legally acceptable by the government? What is the benefit we can get from the government, or what is the effect of that project on our business? So we're going to screen that. Now, so at the screening stage, we are likely to throw away about 6 of our ideas, which originally came from the first stage, to become only 4 ideas to stand there. So now from the 4 ideas, we come to the next step where we call the analyzing and acceptance. So this is where we analyze the project using various investment appraisal techniques, as we'll be looking at in a few minutes in relation to that, where we look at either the NPV project, net present value, modified internal rate of return, payback period, discounted payback period, adjusted present value method, whether actually the project should be undertaken, where we appraise it with this method, whether we can undertake the project. Then also we decide whether it is a go or no go area. All of those things will be analyzed and done there. So at the end of the day, possibly we may be left with 2 projects. at the analyzing and acceptance stage, then what we do there is that we now what? Accept the projects, then we implement it and monitor the projects to make sure that the project achieve the objective for which it was intended. So these are what you have to understand briefly when we talk about the investment decision making process. Now, you can read further in relation to what is contained in your study manual in relation to this one for that one. And in the next lesson, we are going to be starting with the various methods that are used by businesses to actually appraise projects and also help them to make various decisions in their organization. So I'll see you in the next lesson.